Let me ask you a question which sounds simple, yet might take a while to answer and think through. What makes a nation? What makes a society?
Well, from my own understanding, a nation or society is comprised first and foremost of people. People who are united under some banner, be it political, religious, cultural, ethnic, or otherwise. Societies and nations don't form in a vacuum. They more or less form organically. The people, quote unquote, don't decide to create a society separate from any sort of reasons to do so. Look at the United States. The Constitution, which describes how the state will function, is ultimately inseparable from the Declaration of Independence, which tells us why our government should be set up this way. And that document is based upon religious and cultural principles. The Americans asserted that they should have a free nation because of both their understood rights as Englishmen and because these rights come from God.
Is it confession, as one may have mainly concluded 300 years ago? If you are European, you may know of our history and how over the course of several centuries the borders of nations were determined by religious affiliation of its peoples, kings and lords.
Religion rarely has an impact on the borders. Look at Europe before and after the 30 Years' War and the Reformation. Borders weren't defined by religion, they were defined by armies, wars, and diplomacy.
To this day, some European nations are split through confession, and religious conflicts between different confessions persist to this very day. Or is it language? Is that the determining factor in what shapes a nation? This is probably the factor by which 19th century civic nationalists would have determined it. French speakers united in one French nation, and those who speak German united under one German nation under one German language.
If that were true, Kraut, then why did the French, from the Revolution to the Rhine crisis in the 1840s, and even lingering on into the 20th century, seek to have control over the Rhineland? The Rhineland is almost entirely comprised of German speakers, as is Alsace, yet it was coveted by the French. And even the idea of a French nation determined by the French language would have been an anathema. Before the 20th century, what we know as French was localized only to the area around Paris. Outside this, you had dozens of local dialects, and most of them would not call it French. Language was never a determining factor for the civic nationalists. I think this is a bit of a straw man.
And following through that line of thought, many within the latter half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century concluded and professed that the determining factor in what makes a nation is culture.
It's been going on a lot longer than that, Kraut. Far, far longer.
That what binds a nation into one and unites and makes a society is a uniting culture. Or do you believe that it is race and ethnicity that makes a nation and shapes a society into one?
There's a difference between race and ethnicity, Kraut. The way I see it, ethnicity is ancestry combined with culture.
Personally, I reject all these notions and will try my best to explain within this video why I believe that to be.
Well, good luck with that. What do you have left now? Please tell me you aren't going to attempt to define a nation or society by vague and hollow concepts like government structure or quote-unquote liberty.
The idea of uniting a nation around confession died with the kings who professed to have God's authority to enforce God's divine law.
Kraut, following the French Revolution, Europe didn't become instantly secular. In fact, the French lost the war, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, and the peace established at Vienna ensured a Europe ruled by Christian monarchs who officially ruled in the case of Britain and genuinely ruled, as in the case of Russia, by divine right. The secularization of Europe really only began in the 20th century after the First World War.
Confession as a unifying factor within a society is an authoritarian model.
Then explain how the United Kingdom can have an official state church for nearly 500 years, and yet with the exception of Cromwell and the Puritans, who were not part of the Church of England, has never existed as a theocracy. In fact, the vast majority of Christian societies have never been theocracies. I am an evangelical Christian, and yet I fully support freedom of worship, speech, and expression. In what way am I authoritarian?
And as such, a society united around faith is no substitute for liberty.
Ah, see, Kraut, that's your ideological lens. According to you, the conclusion is that the core principle of a society is and can only ever be liberty, that all other ideas are to be subordinate to that concept, however unclear it may be, even if this includes undermining liberal principles.
Uniting a nation around language hits its limitations when you realize that nations that previously existed on the basis of being unified through language, from the British Empire to the Spanish Empire, collapsed into revolt.
Again, this is a straw man. Language is a tool, an element of culture. It's never been any sort of unifying force in and of itself. At most, it's been used by empires and states for ease of communication through a common language and to better transmit culture.
A continent can't be ruled by a peninsula or an island.
Well, sure it can. The Spanish ruled Latin America for centuries, and the British had a long-established rule over India. Just because a rule eventually comes to an end doesn't mean it's an example of a failure.
And having a uniting language is no substitute for liberty. And culture? One of the most prominent cultural revival movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the Irish Cultural Revival Movement, which arose out of a fear of Irish culture being anglicised, and which was a precursor to the nationalist Irish Revolution, promoted in the early days at least by poets and playwrights.
And I think I understand what your overall point here is. Obviously you believe that societies have been built on these ideas, but you're arguing that they shouldn't, and that a society or nation can and should exist without these forces to unify it. Now, I happen to believe that this does not reflect reality, and that people are moved by culture and faith more than political ideals. Now, you want to use the Irish as an example? I can use the Irish as an example. During the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848, 200 to 700 Irish, German, French, Polish, Italian, and other European Catholic immigrants serving in the U.S. Army defected and fought until the end of the war for Mexico under the banner of the St. Patrick's Battalion. Do you know why they did such a thing? They did this out of an act of Catholic unity. They found themselves ultimately driven more by their Catholic faith than by their allegiance to the Republic. This is very telling and shows, I think, the biggest problem with your argument. People will be driven by their culture, religion, and other forces far more than a concept as hollow as the state or liberal principles.
It created a resurgence of a sense of Irishness, revived the Gaelic language, and created works of culture revered to this day. But the traditionalist, back to the roots nature of this movement, didn't provide for a social framework that would combat injustice or guarantee individual liberties within that cultural framework.
Because they were never designed to. You really are starting to sound like an ideologue now. Do you think culture needs to be changed and warped to fit within the liberal framework? Do you think you have the right to judge history in this way, or to tell people they cannot produce works of culture which are illiberal?
The widespread sexual abuse of children by the Catholic Church, the non-existent separation of church and state, the abuse of power by figures of authority, all went unpunished due to them being embedded within the revitalized cultural movement.
Think this argument through, Kraut. You're basically saying that the poetry of Yeats and the Irish cultural revival was bad, was insufficient, because it didn't explicitly condemn or prevent sex abuses in the Catholic Church hundreds of years later. Do you want a poem written about it? Again, this is fundamentally not how culture works. Culture is reactive. It's the outward expression of people rationalizing or giving meaning to the world around them and what's within themselves. Goya's painting of the guerrillas is a reaction to the brutality of the French occupation of Spain. Culture that exists to serve the goals of the state, or by ideologues, is propaganda.
Culture is no substitute for liberty.
It was never designed as such.
Neither is a racially homogeneous society a garant for any liberty, let alone a free existence. A couple of months ago, I hinted that I was intending on making a video on Swiss democracy and why I believe people should take a closer, more in-depth look at it to learn something from it. And it is within that context in which I intend to do so, within a video directed at the alt-right, as well as many more people I have encountered claiming to fight for society and its preservation on ideological and tribalistic factors as their basis for unification.
These ideological and tribal factors are what have created every society in history. No society has ever been created in this nice liberal vacuum. No group of people have ever decided to build a nation on principles completely separate from history, religion, and culture. This idea of society for society's sake does not exist in reality.
Switzerland is a nation of many faiths. Historically, the isolated lands within the Alps provided an ideal place for those fleeing persecution to go, from Calvinists to German Catholics to French Huguenots.
And societies formed within Switzerland with a unifying ethos, be it religious or cultural. Look at Geneva under John Calvin. You're just proving my point here. Societies and communities formed within Switzerland out of circumstance, not by some sort of artificially created state.
Switzerland is also a nation of 4 languages: French, Italian, Refro-Romanic, and German. And with that, it is also a nation of more than 4 cultures. These are all factors which would traditionally have fallen into the category of factors that would cause disunity rather than unity, at least according to the main driving political forces that have shaped Europe's nations over the course of the last 400 years.
Are you saying that there is no such thing as Swiss culture, Kraut? Because I think a lot of Swiss might disagree with that.
Yet despite that, the Swiss have been united not as the French, Germans, or Italian population groups, or as varying religious groups, but as one nation under 4 languages, several cultures, several religious confessions, yet one nation, as one Swiss people, for over 500 years as the Swiss Confederation.
Yep, the borders and peoples of Switzerland and their government have never changed in 500 years.
The one thing which has united this nation and its people has been a common agreement and commitment on the preservation not of some concept of culture, faith, or race, or language, but of democracy and the values of a free society.
Kraut, that constitution is from 1848. Do you think the Swiss have had the same government for 500 years? If not, how then were they united before the 19th century?
What I love so much about this document, besides the fact that it is one of Europe's oldest constitutions, is how it outlines a commitment to democracy and to protect the individual rights and liberties of the nation's citizens.
And this is my main issue with your argument. Switzerland isn't a democracy because of its constitution, or because the people decided to establish the nation as such. It's a democracy because the culture and the society of Switzerland lends itself well to democracy. Liberal principles act as restraints to prevent abuse of power. They were never meant to act as an ideology or societal foundation. Culture forms society, which forms government, not the reverse.
There is no emphasis on race, faith, culture, or other tribalistic preference, but a clearly outlined commitment that what holds this nation together and what provides the framework for the existence of this nation is a common commitment by the citizens to ensure and guarantee the liberties and rights of the citizens of this society.
The Constitution is in German. This shows that there's a cultural basis for the Swiss nation. And again, you have to understand that these ideas have a basis in culture. Only a people who are willing to accept liberty will be able to possess it. This is evident in the Iraq War and the neoconservative foreign policy, which views culture and religion as being ultimately secondary, and that democracies can just be planted anywhere in the world regardless of the cultural and religious background. And I hope we've all realized by now that this is simply not the case, that people are ultimately driven more by forces like culture or religion than by quote-unquote democracy.
And to me personally, that is the ideal that I strive for and which I argue for. My cause is not to ensure that my society is religiously, lingually, culturally, or ethnically homogeneous. My cause are the values and principles of a free society.
And this is culture, democracy. The idea that the people should rule is a concept born out of Western culture. It often has nothing to do with the structure of government. Take a nation like East Germany. By all objective measures, it's a republic. It has a parliament, political parties, and all the structure of a republican government. But it was anything but democratic. The people did not have rights, and they did not have the ability to exercise their political will. And then look at the United Kingdom. It is officially a monarchy. The Queen reigns by the grace of God and must give her approval for every law. But by every other measure, Britain is a democracy. The people, for centuries, have had rights and a say in the government. This is due to the culture and the nature of the people. Democracy describes the political culture and the reality of a nation, where a republic describes the structure of government. If a republic is the body, then democracy is the soul. And people will only be able to accept democracy not by force, not by implementing a republic, by accepting that idea culturally. And this happens gradually, organically, if at all.
Let me rephrase the question somewhat for you. If you are someone who argues for a cultural or ethnic or racially homogeneous society and uses one of these causes as your primary point of argumentation, what exactly is a purely Catholic, a purely German, or a purely white society worth when you live in a miserable existence in chains under serfdom?
And what is a democracy worth if the people have no cultural or religious identity? There is nothing left but the state.
Whatever cause you may have written upon your flag as the prime motivator for your political and cultural engagement, none of these causes are in any way a viable substitute for liberty and the rights of man.
Even though societies throughout history have been founded on cultural and religious ideas and have upheld the rights of man, the Imperial German Constitution of 1871 ensured universal male suffrage. This idea that a society built upon religion or culture or ethnicity is inherently unfit to uphold the rights of man is not only flat out untrue, but it really shows your ideological convictions. To you, the idea of liberty, even when it's a nebulous and vague concept, is a moral absolute to be served as one would serve our king. But once again, this is not how liberty works. Individual rights work as amendments or laws ensuring freedom of speech, expression, religion, etc. These are concrete ideas that actually impact men, not some ethereal idea of liberty in the abstract.
And it has always been those who have proclaimed to fight for the preservation of the tribe who have in the end inflicted most harm upon that very tribe. The great cultural revival movements of Ireland produced what were arguably the best novelists and playwrights of the last century. Yet these minds were tossed aside by those who seized the political drive for creating an Irish society, proclaiming that Irishness was deeply tied to the authority of the Catholic Church and those who owned the land, creating the nourishing ground upon which the systematic rape of children and some of the worst corruption in a European nation was made possible.
This is a non sequitur. I've said it before, and it should be obvious. The people involved in the Irish cultural revival have absolutely nothing to do with this. And if your point is that the culture was insufficient to stop the abuse, then neither was the structure of the Irish Republic or their democratic constitution.
And one has to almost laugh at the cranks and morons who proclaimed to preserve German culture during the first half of the 20th century. Even the slowest of minds would see through the hypocritic farce that is the burning of books in the name of preserving culture.
So, Kraut, what are you planning to do with illiberal works of culture?
An assembly of delusional losers and failed artists who believed that they knew what culture was, but created a pseudo-culture in its stead, whilst almost exterminating German culture itself.
And you're doing the same exact thing. This is an example of how people following a political ideology, be it liberal, fascist, or otherwise, seek to dominate culture and force it to fit their ideology, and ultimately destroy culture. You're essentially saying that German culture is meaningless if it has no power to provide a sense of unity or society, which again, as history shows, is not true. Now, as another example of this, there was a song written in 1813 by Ernst Moritz Arndt called Was ist des deutschen Vaterland? What is the German fatherland? It was written during the Napoleonic Wars when the French Empire had conquered much of Germany, and following Napoleon's retreat from Russia, the German states and people rose up against the French occupation. The song follows a list of all the constituent German states from Prussia to Austria to Bavaria and asserts that no, all of the states are the German fatherland. It never states exactly what it means to be German, the culture, religion, or government, but that there is a uniquely German culture and that these people are German by God. So implicitly, there is a cultural and religious sense in being German in the song. The song itself is a work of culture. I think my point here is that, like with the St. Patrick's Battalion, people will be driven by culture and religion more so than politics.
No, it is always those who proclaim to be saving culture, from the here in the past to the Middle East in the present, who ended up destroying culture.
Well, that's totally not overlooking countless counterexamples or anything.
Because culture is not ideological. Culture
What are you talking about? If you believe that Christianity is an ideology, then explain how Christian art and music isn't culture.
is not the servant of anyone's political whims and neuroses.
So long as it serves to support liberalism.
Culture is an organic process. It is an expression of a society's artistic affinities and joys, not through order and systematic structured processes, but through the collective gathering together of individual actions and behaviors.
Exactly, Kraut. And guess what? So is society. No nation, no government has ever been created out of thin air, with no historical, cultural, religious, or other background. A final example of this is the communist states. Even though all of them were established under explicitly Marxist principles, no two communist nations were the same. This is due to culture.
It is the sum of individual actions rather than anything that could ever possibly be guided by any kind of political belief or motivation. To attempt to control culture is to attempt to control the preferences of individuals,
Like with what you want in the establishment of a liberal government.
and as such, it is destined to fail before even beginning.
Straw man.
Someone proclaiming to be arguing or fighting for the supposed collective good, or to use the notorious phrase, the right side of history, is to be treated with the same amount of suspicion and contempt, no matter what political standing they may hold.
I'll keep that in mind next time I watch your videos.
It is the rights and freedoms of the individual that take precedence over the supposed common good.
No, Kraut. The rights of the individual are part of the common good. Liberty, the idea that men should have freedom, is supported both because people believe they are inherently part of natural law and because they work for the good of everyone in society. They don't exist in a vacuum.
As it is the actions and the will of these multiple individuals that in the end shape society and guarantee that these rights and liberties within such a society are not undermined.
Then explain how every society that wasn't or isn't a liberal democracy manages to exist. The existence of a society or a nation isn't predicated on the idea of liberalism. And I think this is what liberals don't understand. Societies as individuals are not confined to the abstract idea of liberty. There are values and principles which will always be more important to people than political ideals. Societies have to be founded on something solid, like culture or faith, not politics. Diabana.
There in the pueblos and hillsides that I saw the mistake I had made. Part of a conquering army with the morals of a bayonet blade. And there amidst all these poor dying Catholics, screaming children, the burning stench of it all, myself and 200 Irishmen decided to rise to the call. From Dublin City to San Diego, we witnessed freedom denied, so we formed the St. Patrick Battalion, and we fought on the Mexican side. We formed the St. Patrick Battalion, and we fought on the Mexican side. March beneath the green flag of St. Patrick, emblazoned with Erin Goldra, bright with the harp and the shamrock, and Libertad para la Republica. Just 50 years after Wolfe Tone.